Hello, everyone. Our speaker today is Dr. Laura Colmenaro-Chilberg, a professor in sociology from Black Hills State University, who received her PhD at South Dakota State University. Before coming to BHSU, she taught in Detroit at Marygrove College. Her research interests include issues in gender equality, most specifically in the area of pop culture. Let's all give a warm welcome to Dr. Chilberg.
Thingy. Now I can hear myself. There's a little bit of reverberation back, not too much. Thank you for coming this evening. I really appreciate that you did turn up here, whether you had a carrot dangled in front of you or whether or not you came because you thought it might be an interesting topic. Thank you all for being here. Oh, you didn't tell me you were going to take them while I'm speaking. I thought we were going to do this afterwards. This whole kind of, you're going to have pictures taken, you're going to be recorded kind of thing, they kind of sneak that information in there to you. All right, tonight what I'm going to talk about, and what I'd like to do is be able to get the slide up there if I could. How do I do that? There we go. That's the official title of the presentation, Women's Agency. Got two. That one's for me. Women's Agency is Madness, the yellow wallpaper to Penny Dreadful. Come on in. Come on. I have a particular interest in issues of popular culture. I'm sort of an unusual sociologist. My undergraduate degrees were in English and history. My master's was in literature, and my PhD is in sociology. So I'm not the kind of person that goes out there and takes a look at census data and talks about poverty. I like to talk about fairy tales and images of gender in them. I like to talk about television programs and novels and different kinds of things. So what you'll hear tonight is sort of an interdisciplinary kind of presentation on how women have been represented related to the issue of madness throughout history. Madness. That word brings a cascade of popular cultural images to mind. Some people think of Norse berserkers running headlong into battle. Others might think of Shakespeare's Ophelia. There she is. Broken by love madness from the cruelty of her beloved Hamlet. When down her weedy trophies and herself fell in the weeping brook, her clothes spread wide and mermaid-like, a while they bore her up, which time she chanted snatches of old tunes, as one incapable of her own distress, or like a creature native and endued unto that element. But long it could not be till that her garments, heavy with their drink, pulled the poor wretch from her melodious lay to muddy death. So Shakespeare in the 1500s is talking about women and madness because, of course, Ophelia dies because she is madness struck by her love for Hamlet. Maybe a little bit closer to where we are right now, the image that comes to mind is that of that abandoned forever bride, Miss Havisham, in Charles Dickens' Great Expectations. Or maybe, if you're a traditionalist, there's Miss Havisham. Forgot to change it. Maybe if you're a traditionalist, you'll be thinking about the ancient Greek Maenads, madly worshiping Dionysus, the raving ones dancing in a frenzy of intoxication, intoxicated by wine and their revels. Or if the images that pop into mind are somewhat more recent, maybe you're going to think of The Hobbit's Gollum. Or, even more recently than that, maybe the insane fan in Stephen King's Misery. The possibilities are endless for us to take a look at. But while we see images of both males and females in madness throughout history, one thing is very clear. Much of the discourse about madness has revolved around the condemnation of and an attempt to control women. What do we mean when we say madness? Well, the definition that I use is Andrew Scull's from a really, really interesting book called Madness in Civilization. It's a cultural history of madness from the ancient times to present day. He says it is massive and lasting disturbances of reason, intellect, and emotions, resulting in sadness, isolation, alienation, misery, and the death of reason and of consciousness. When we're in the company of the mad, we feel a frisson of horror, seeing the images, hearing the sounds, witnessing the irrationality, all which call up a primal fear, and with it this stigmatizing label of madness. What then is the difference between madness and mental illness? Well, the medicalization of madness, and with it the development of the term mental illness, seeing madness as an illness, something that you could cure, began during the 19th century, when it became the purview of males in the medical profession. Today, mainly sociologists would say mental illness is a socially constructed malady, largely defined by the DSM-5, that's that Diagnostic Statistical Manual 5, a quite controversial diagnosis tool. In this presentation, however, I want to focus on the original definition of madness. The history of women and madness, in particular what becomes known as hysteria, is going to be our focus. Throughout Western history, we have seen this kind of deviance named in a variety of different ways when it's been applied to women. The kinds of terms we've heard are women who are uppity, women who are sinful, women who are mad. The focus, then, of this presentation tonight is going to be on two historical works of literature that defined female agency as madness. An agency from a sociological point of view is action, taking action, having control. Charlotte Bronte's Jane Eyre, and the ones that I've chosen, they did an interview on South Dakota Public Radio the other day, and he said, why did you choose these? Well, the different kinds of pop culture that I chose, I did so because I knew that my audience was primarily going to be a popular audience, so I wanted to choose works that people were most likely familiar with. So Charlotte Bronte's Jane Eyre, you may have read the book, or you may have seen the movie or the Masterpiece Theater, or any of those kinds of things. Charlotte Perkins Gilman's The Yellow Wallpaper. A lot of people read that if you take Intro to Literature in college, or you read it a lot of times in high school also. These will be compared to several examples of modern and contemporary popular culture, including Tennessee Williams' Streetcar Named Desire. And some of you may not be familiar with Streetcar Named Desire, but, and here's my bad acting, Stella! You ever heard that? People do that? That comes from Streetcar Named Desire, the movie Streetcar Named Desire, not the original play by Tennessee Williams. We're going to look at Quentin Tarantino's two-part movie, Kill Bill 1 and 2. And we're going to look at a television series that actually was all finished up, unfortunately, last semester, which is Showtime's Penny Dreadful. And I don't know if any of you have seen that. It's really kind of an odd but really fascinating take on Victorian England. While we might expect that in the past women might have been controlled by that threat of the label insane, we'll see that today this same kind of women's agency is also often sometimes seen as crazy, continuing a long-standing tradition of controlling women by defining them as insane. So where did this all come about from? Well, really the earliest image of madness that we find in history comes from about 1900 BC. It comes from ancient Egypt, and the condition was thought to be what we today would call hysteria. Hysteria is an interesting word because it is based on the Latin word for uterus, and that sort of automatically makes mental illness, madness, into a female malady. The explanation for why women suffer from this mental disorder remains constant throughout much of history. It is the spontaneous movement of the uterus in women's bodies. And the symptoms include things like seizures, a sense of suffocation, and a fear of impending death. treatment was logical within the time context. You're going to think it sounds silly, but within the time, it makes sense. The uterus had to be driven back to its proper location. The perception was that the woman's uterus was sort of wandering around her body in places it shouldn't be. So it needed to be drawn and pushed back to where it was supposed to be. Now, we're not going to do that physically back in ancient Egypt, but what we're going to do is we're going to take foul-smelling and pungent odors, and we're going to place them near the woman's mouth and nose, and then we take sweet-smelling ones and place them next to the vagina, thus driving the uterus down and drawing it back to its place that it's supposed to be. It's also interesting to note that another term for madness, lunacy, I love those pictures. I think these are okay copyright-wise. I Googled them. But that's an example of what we would call lunacy. Luna is Latin for the moon, and lunacy is madness often thought to have been brought on by the moon. And clear links, of course, the moon, women, and menstruation. There's clear links between that also and madness related to women. The ancient Greeks also saw the uterus as the offending part of the body. Best known, perhaps, are two doctors, Hippocrates and Galen, and they saw its irregular movement as the cause of women's madness. The reason for the movement, however, differed from what the ancient Egyptians had talked about. They felt that the organ, the uterus, suffered from melancholy brought on by the lack of carnal satisfaction. In other words, it wasn't getting enough sex. Unmarried, sterile, and widowed women were encouraged to engage in sexual activity to stop the movement of the uterus. But if it did occur, the cure was the same odor treatment as the ancient Egyptians had come up with. So the meaning's different, but the cure is the same. When we look at another ancient culture, Rome, we find similar remedies, including purges, herbs with strong odors, pushing that women get married, and limiting those activities that could excite women. Greek and Roman explanations and treatments retained authority for a very, very long time, even after the fall of Rome. Once we sort of enter into the Middle Ages, there was a woman physician, and there were very few of them during the Middle Ages. She was an Italian, Trotula de Ruggiero, the first woman physician in Christian Europe. And she identified, again, abstinence as the root cause of hysteria and melancholy in women. And even Abbess Hildegard von Bingen, I don't know if you're familiar with her, she was known, she was an abbess, she was known also as a doctor, but she was also known as, what would we call her? She was a, say again, spiritualist? To some degree, the way, as much as a Catholic abbess could be during the Middle Ages. So she was very, very well known. And she used a religious explanation. She said that the mental disorders were incurable and the result of original sin. But the interesting thing is she held both men and women responsible for original sin, which is not something that you hear. And pretty soon St. Thomas Aquinas sticks his nose into it. And the more popular path of misogyny is where we head down. He identified women as defective and inferior and totally responsible for original sin and also, therefore, their madness. It is at this time in history that women with these disorders began to be the target of supernatural explanations for their mental ailments, with exorcism being identified as the appropriate cure for them. In the early Middle Ages, exorcism was not considered a punishment for women's sin. Instead, it was a cure for the illness caused by the sin, which is different because pretty soon, by the end of the late Middle Ages, you get Heinrich Kramer and Jakob Sprenger's, if you've heard of it, Malleus Maleficarum, which is the witch hunter's manual, and attitudes change. It's all about punishing women. It's all about their demonic possession. It's not any longer about treatment of mental disorders. Throughout the Renaissance and into the modern age, the focus of explaining mental disorders in women was still on the uterus. So we're getting all the way up into the 1800s. For example, Victorian women carried smelling salts. What were the smelling salts for? Anybody know? Say again? They fainted, and it brought them back to consciousness, right? Not really. What the smelling salts were for, the reason why women fainted was because of the uterus being out of place. And what you needed to do with the smelling salts, that would force the uterus back into place, and women would regain consciousness, not because of the smelling salts, but because the uterus had gone back to its appropriate place. Now, we have, and I didn't know that till I started studying this, we've always thought, pretty much that smelling salts, it's because they have that horrible smell and they kind of surprise you into consciousness. Well, originally that was not the original intention for them. In the late 19th century, America, beliefs about what caused madness in women included grief, use of abusive language, suppressed menstruation, sexual promiscuity, so that's the opposite of what they were saying beforehand, epilepsy, overexertion, disagreement with the dominant religious beliefs, and failure to accept male authority. All of which, if the woman was defined as mad, could result in her imprisonment in an asylum. And if you know anything about 18th, 19th century asylums, they were not pretty places to be. Today, we still focus primarily on women. According to Behavioral Trends in the United States, results from the 2014 Survey on Drug Use and Health, sponsored by the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services, women are more likely to suffer from a serious mental illness than men, except in the case of schizophrenia, autism spectrum disorder, and ADHD. Madness remains primarily woman-identified. So where do we go from there? Well, let's take a look at madness and at traditional gender roles and see how that all fits together. And then we'll pull in the mass media. So we've got beliefs about correct gender behaviors that have run through every part of society, historically and present day. And we train girls and boys into how to do gender right from when they get that little blue hat or that little pink hat. Okay? We know things like with baby boys, people are more physically energetic with them. They allow them to engage in greater amounts of aggressive behavior, etc. And with little girls, exactly the opposite. So we socialize. I'm a sociologist. I do not believe that this is genetic. I believe that the way men and women behave is because that's how we raise them. And we raise them that way because we think that's the best way for them to be. Traditionally, women are identified as dependent, men as independent. Women as caregivers, men as breadwinners. Women as passive, men as aggressive. Women as incompetent, men as powerful, often over women. Women are required to provide self-denying generosity, to limit their physical location, primarily to their homes, and not to engage in adventurous or sexual behaviors. We were just having a discussion this afternoon with my collective behavior class, and we were talking about rumors and gossip, and we were talking about high school students and college students and gossiping about sexual activities. And we realized that when we gossip about males and sexual activities, it's done in a very positive sense usually. Even when we say somebody's a player, there's sort of an element of compliment that's in there. But if a young woman is sexually promiscuous, we have a whole boatload of names that we call her. And when we gossip about her, we do not gossip nice things about her. So there's this difference that goes on related to sexuality and sexual behavior. Women are required to look pleasing as well as to be chaste, emotional, nice, and flexible. On the other hand, men are encouraged to compete, to be adventurous, courageous, and sexually active. They are to limit all emotions except for aggression and anger and be rational, logical, and independent. Madness, which can be seen as rampant emotionality, is the very antithesis of logic and rationality, and therefore seen as a feminine characteristic. Images in the media, both past and present, still often represent traditional gender roles. But what about the images related specifically to women in madness? Do these two identify a narrow role for women, a role that is both confining and limiting? Okay, where am I supposed to point? There we go. Okay, so the first book that I wanted to take a look at was Jane Eyre. And you see that nice little picture of Jane over there on the left-hand side. If you're familiar with the story of Jane Eyre, you may know that the woman on the right-hand side there is Bertha Mason. That's the story is that Rochester has hidden his mad wife in the attic. She's that original mad woman in the attic there. Charlotte Bronte's Jane Eyre provides us with the character of Bertha Mason, Rochester's mad wife. Confined and hidden in the attic, Bronte describes Bertha as both hideous and violent. In the deep shade at the further end of the room, a figure ran backwards and forwards. What it was, whether beast or human being, one could not at first sight tell. It groveled, seemingly on all fours. It snatched and growled like some strange wild animal, but it was covered with clothing, and a quantity of dark, grizzled hair, wild as a mane, hid its head and face. Bertha's madness is inherited from her mother, who is described as a mad woman and a drunkard. So over-imbibing and drunkenness also is considered to be madness in women. And like her mother, after marriage, Bertha becomes intemperate and unchaste. She fails to meet many of the traditionally required characteristics of a woman of the Victorian time period. Most particularly, she breaks the sexual behavior rule. Described as a monster of sexual appetite, Bronte ties Bertha's madness to her female sexuality, reporting that during blood-red moons, she becomes most vicious and destructive, hallucinating a familiar who tells her to burn people in their beds at night, to stab them, to bite their flesh from their bones. At first glance, Bertha appears to be the insane foil to Jane's sane, grounded pragmatism, because that's how we represent her. That's how she's always been represented. She is a sane, very well-grounded, pragmatic young woman. But is she? Or is Bertha really the cautionary example to rein in Jane's passionate and independent nature? Worried about the possibility of descending into love madness. Remember Ophelia and love madness, killing herself, etc. Jane says, "It is madness in all women to let a secret love kindle within them, which, if unreturned and unknown, must devour the life that feeds it, and if discovered and responded to, must lead will-o'-the-wisp-like into miry wilds whence there is no extrication." And when she's pressured by Rochester, because he knows he's got a wife hidden up there in the attic that's mad, so he cannot marry Jane, at least at the beginning, so he pressures her to become his mistress, Jane attempts to stave off her own madness. "I will keep the law given by God, sanctioned by man. I will hold to the principles received by men when I was sane, and not mad as I am now. It is because I am insane, quite insane, with my veins running fire and my heart beating faster than I can count its throbs." So she sees this romantic passion that she has for Rochester as true insanity. It's not only a fear of madness, though, that concerns Jane, but it is also a fear of the loss of herself. She comes to realize that her relationship with Rochester will never be one of equal partners, an idea clearly but subtly communicated by his gently couched threats. It is your time now, little tyrant, but it will be mine presently. And once I have fairly seized you to have and to hold, I'll just, figuratively speaking, attach you to a chain like this, touching his watchguard. While Bronte never discusses wandering uteruses, the failure of Bertha to conform to society's expectations resulted in her incarceration in her own private asylum. The message is clear. If Jane does not control her own passions and toe the gender line, Rochester may have to lock her up too. Now, that's not the normal thing we hear, because at the end of Jane Eyre, they get married, he goes blind and she's there to nurse him, and we focus on how this independent woman actually gets the man that she loves. But there's a subtext to Jane Eyre that deals with this issue of madness. The next one is Charlotte Perkins Gilman's The Yellow Wallpaper, and it continues the same theme as we see in Jane Eyre. A woman's perceived madness is seen as both a symptom of and a cause of a woman's descent into madness. A little background on the story. The story centers on another Jane, a woman who has been confined by her husband, John. Usually she's confined in their upstairs bedroom. She's another one of those mad women in the attic. Lost my place, sorry. The room has been papered in a horrible shade of yellow. She says the color is repellent, almost revolting, a smoldering, unclean yellow. And while that one's not as unclean, that one over there looks pretty nasty. And the pictures, it was kind of fun going through, Googling images, because some of the yellows that they chose are just really disgusting colors. The confinement that she is suffering is what's called a Victorian neurasthenic rest cure. And that's a real thing. Charlotte Perkins Gilman didn't make it up. It's been prescribed by John, her husband, who is a doctor, because he feels she's suffering from just a temporary nervous depression, a slight hysterical tendency. The neurasthenic rest cure was developed by a very well-respected physician, S. Weir Mitchell, during the 19th century. Treatments included, and this is an example of one of those women having one of these fainting swoons that they supposedly are suffering. And then here's the neurasthenic kind of rest cure. Treatment included enforced bed rest, isolation, forced feeding, and a variety of different kinds of massages. And that's what the guy over there on the right-hand side, he's not engaging in inappropriate sexual behaviors. He is massaging her stomach, and they massage stomachs and arms and legs. And this is another example of trying to push that uterus back to where it goes. There was another picture. I didn't use it, because it was... There's this naked woman sitting in a chair, and they have this hose of water that they're shooting at her stomach. Another form of water massage to try to get the uterus back to where it's supposed to be so that these women will no longer suffer from madness. Perkins Gilman's description of this cure in The Yellow Wallpaper rings particularly true because she had actually been a patient of Weir's after suffering what today would have been called acute postpartum depression after the birth of her daughter. In her autobiography, The Living of Charlotte Perkins Gilman, she reports Weir's prescription. Live as domestic a life as possible. Have your child with you at all times. Lie down an hour after each meal. Have but 2 hours intellectual life a day. And never touch pen, brush, or pencil as long as you live. It is clear that John places the blame for the condition directly on Jane, who he sees behaving in a way that perpetuates a false and foolish fancy. Jane's a writer, and they have taken all of her paper, all of her pens and pencils away from her. She sneaks some of the time and writes, but John sees this intellectual activity that she engaged that she engages in, this is what's causing her madness. Whatever the reason, she's expected to spend most of her time resting in the ugly yellow bedroom, overseen or, I think, spied on by her husband, and he enlists one of the female servants to spy on her at all times. And she's ordered to rest and spend her life passively isolated and with no mental activity. With nothing to occupy her, her focus and then her obsession becomes the horrible yellow wallpaper. I'm going to go back so that you can see the pictures there. This sort of, her first hallucination is eyes. She perceives that there are these bulbous eyes that are staring at her unblinking, and they're constantly watching her. This kind of might be a reference to, there's a new kind of prison that's developed at this time. It's called a panopticon. And a panopticon is where the people who run the prison are in the center, and the people that are in the prison are all the way around. It's a circular prison, and you can see into all of the cells. So the people that are in the cells are never out of the sight of the people who are in control of them and are always watching them. And this idea seems to sort of find its way into this story also. Although she is originally in a nursery, the room that they have was originally a nursery. The room does have other prison-like characteristics, including bars on the windows, and there are rings mounted on the wall, bringing to mind shackled prisoners. Jane's delusion soon changes. In addition to the eyes, she begins to see a figure moving beneath the wallpaper, and that's what that first picture there is. It is like a woman stooping down and creeping about behind that pattern. Eventually, Jane begins to tear the wallpaper off the walls, trying to get to the figure imprisoned behind it. But by the time it is all removed, Jane herself has begun creeping about the walls, telling John, "I've got out at last, in spite of you and Jane, and I've pulled off most of the paper, so you can't put me back." Jane is no longer Jane, but has become the woman trapped behind the wallpaper. Perkins Gilman's short story gives us both a view of how women were controlled by the male application of the label mad, and how the imposition of that stigmatizing label may actually intensify the harmful attacks of the mental disorders. So let's go a little bit farther, getting closer to where we are right now. Tennessee Williams, A Streetcar Named Desire, and actually, when I was an undergraduate, I did a special topics course on Tennessee Williams. He's one of my favorite playwrights from this period of history. And I got to tell you, almost every single play that Tennessee Williams writes has women who are insane in it, women who are mad, sometimes gently mad, sometimes much more so. Switch time periods to the mid-20th century through present day, and we find a very different collection of popular culture choices. A mid-20th century investigation of the madness of women can be seen in Tennessee Williams' A Streetcar Named Desire. Williams identified the main theme in all of his fiction as the destructive impact of society on the sensitive, nonconformist individual. And that sort of is moving its way to what sociologists identify as mental illness. We see it as a social construction. We define it as mentally ill. And therefore we act as if it is. So that's basically what he's talking about. Blanche Dubois, and that's a picture of Blanche up there, aptly illustrates this kind of person. Beautiful, delicate, sexually promiscuous, dependent on the kindness of strangers, and somewhat eccentric in attitude, speech, and dress, Blanche loses her job and their family home and turns to her sister and brother-in-law, Stella and Stanley Kowalski, for support. Raised with her sister in shabby refinement, Blanche is unable to accept the lifestyle of the Kowalskis, seeing it as vulgar and brutal. Initially merely unwelcomed by her brother-in-law, tensions continue to rise, culminating in Blanche's rape by Stanley. Stella, her sister, chooses to believe Stanley over her own sister about the rape and tells a friend, "I couldn't believe her story and go on living with Stanley." It is Stella that calls the asylum to institutionalize her sister. Blanche's emotional and eccentric nature, coupled with her sexual promiscuity, breaks the gender rules, and her punishment is to be publicly indicted, imprisoned, and labeled crazy. Just as in Jane Eyre and The Yellow Wallpaper, it is the male that controls a woman's life and dispenses punishment for what he deems unwomanly and deviant behavior through rape and the label crazy. Kill Bill 1 and 2, on the other hand, provides us with the character of the bride, and that's the bride right there. An atypical woman who on the surface fails to fit the traditional characteristics of a woman. She is a martial arts-trained assassin, and she's part of what's called the Deadly Viper Assassination Squad, the Divas, D-V-A-S, I love that. The bride becomes tired of that life. She falls in love, she becomes pregnant, and is at the church about to be married when the Divas arrives, led by her past boss, lover, and the father of her unborn child, Bill. The squad kills everyone, and Bill shoots the bride in the head. She falls into a coma and awakens 4 years later with a steel plate in her head and no child, catapulting her on a campaign of revenge against the Divas. She plans to kill them all, saving Bill for last so he can suffer the anticipation of his impending death. She is successful in her revenge, but discovers that her daughter actually lived and was raised by her father, Bill. The bride kills Bill, hence the name, and she and her daughter go off together, mother and child reunited. So how does this fit? Well, at first, the character of the bride doesn't seem to conform to traditional woman's role script. She's aggressive, she's courageous, and she's adventurous, and she uses logic to guide her actions, all male characteristics. But it is clearly emotion and the denial of motherhood that guides her path of revenge. Her grief at the assumed death of her child pushes her over the line from sanity to insanity. Where her past assassinations were business, the death of the Divas is personal, maternal, and ruthlessly violent. There are no accusations of insanity directed at the bride, but the impetus for her actions is clearly outside of the norm and as a result of behaviors that have typically resulted in a label of insanity. The last contemporary mass media is Showtime's series Penny Dreadful. This is a really interesting program on many, many different levels. It is a mashup of a variety of different Victorian monster stories. So what you have here is Dorian Gray, that's Dorian Gray right there, from Oscar Wilde's The Picture of Dorian Gray. Victor Frankenstein, that's Victor Frankenstein over there. His monster is also in the television program, an updated Bride of Frankenstein, and then they actually create a second monster. So that comes from Mary Shelley's Frankenstein. You have from Bram Stoker's Dracula, Van Helsing, Renfield, and Count Dracula. That's the monster. That's the Frankenstein monster. They don't have the picture on here of Dracula and the rest of them. We also have Dr. Henry Jekyll from Robert Louis Stevenson's Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. He's not up there either. This woman here is a witch. That guy over there is some kind of a wizard. He's a servant, but he's got some really odd kinds of characteristics too. But the three of them are not named characters from those kinds of novels. Then you add to this set of literary characters Sir Malcolm Murray, an African explorer. He's the guy over there in the hat. Ethan Chandler, an American werewolf gunslinger. Okay, that's Ethan right there. And then the focus of the story, which is Vanessa Ives, a sometimes demon-possessed witch. And that's her right there. And this is also her. The character of Vanessa Ives certainly falls into the category of mad hysteric. She is over-the-top emotional, sexually promiscuous, a practitioner of witchcraft, and a target of the devil and of Dracula. The season 3 opener finds her dirty, unkempt, and eating like an animal. And I chose that picture because it is kind of reminiscent of Bertha Mason in Jane Eyre. And this was the only one that I could find. There was one that I remember from watching the episode where she is on her hands and knees, just kind of crouched down on the floor. She has food, like this big, huge leg of meat in front of her, no bowls, no plates or anything, and she's tearing at the meat, and she looks like an animal. She looks like Bertha Mason is described in Jane Eyre. Her bouts of deep depression and catatonia fit well within the criteria of madness established for the time period. She is put into a mental institution by her family, and she returns later on. But it is not only Vanessa who suffers from deep pits of depression from which they struggle to escape. And that's what makes Penny Dreadful interesting to me. In fact, most of the male characters, too, have these same troubles, and almost all of their origins or have their origins in family issues, usually seen as the concern of female characters. Victor Frankenstein up here, he's an opium addict. He allows his fascination with science to lead him to take on the role of God and create life, the original male Frankenstein monster, a second male creature and a female bride. Victor is horrified at the first creature, both because of his shocking physical deformity and the anger he directs at his maker. And you can, let me go back one, you can see, it's kind of far away, but there, his face is very white. You can, there are no little bolts coming out of his neck like you see in the Frankenstein movies, but you can see the scars. Part of his hair is missing. He's very, very unusual looking, very soft-spoken, though, and this Frankenstein monster can speak unlike the traditional one that we find. So Victor is horrified by him. In turn, the original monster despises Victor, and in revenge, the monster kills the second male with whom Victor has actually bonded. Trying to placate the creature, Victor creates a bride for him, but she rejects both of them. Victor, the father figure who incestuously lusts after her, and the monster. Suffering from grief and betrayal by the family he has created, Victor enters a lingering, drug-fueled depression. Sir Malcolm, over there in the hat, lets his obsession with Africa stand in the way of being a good father. He loses his son because the man is unable to achieve his father's high standards, dying in the attempt. He loses his daughter to vampirism, and his wife is killed by his mistress, that witch over there. She kills her. His disastrous family relationships send him over the edge into alcohol abuse and depression. But he doesn't, and Victor Frankenstein, neither one of them end up in the asylum. But Vanessa Ives does. It is family, too, that haunts Ethan Chandler, as well as his uncontrollable and violent werewolf alter ego. At the end of season 2, Chandler's father kidnaps his son and has him transported in chains back to the American Southwest. Guilt at the murders he unknowingly commits when in his werewolf form, and clearly coming from a severely dysfunctional family, contributes to Chandler's own isolation and depression and the denial of his love and the abandonment of Vanessa. Hysterical behavior in Penny Dreadful does not limit itself to a single gender, but paints both sexes with its brush. Throughout history, we have seen women controlled by men who determine when their behavior is rational and when it is mad. Popular culture throughout history has reflected this image of women, and we still see elements of it today in our popular culture. However, we are also seeing the redefinition of gender roles in some of these fictional works to include male characters who clearly have adopted some characteristics of women's madness. Where are we going to end up? We'll have to see. Thank you. Okay. Anybody have any questions?
There's so many.
Yeah. Can you hear her? She's saying that she sees that there could be a whole semester in this. And actually, I'm teaching an honors colloquium in the fall that is about this. It is about madness in popular culture. I'm going to predominantly focus on women. In fact, I was having a lot of fun this afternoon trying to come up with the women's images from literature and from movies that I want to do. I've been thinking about the bell jar and what's it called? Girl Interrupted would be a more modern one. I was thinking about King Lear and Hamlet. There's a wide variety of things. So I'm going to have a lot of fun this fall, broadening it out to a full semester. Oh, there's lots and lots. What's interesting, though, is that the images of madness of men throughout history are very different than the images of women. Men, sure, they end up in insane asylums, too. King Lear is clearly insane. Hamlet, there's been a discussion from the 1500s to present day about, is Hamlet mad or is he actually seeing the ghost of his father? So there are images, but the treatment of women and the stigmatization of women and the ending up of women in these bizarre, insane asylums where they do very, very weird things, very, very different from how men are treated. So we're going to talk about that next semester too. I am greatly looking forward to teaching that class. Yes?
A correlation between, it's not fiction, the last president, Ron. They treated Miss Clinton like she was borderline.
Actually, in that, I let the man who interviewed me on South Dakota Public Radio, I let him head me into that direction. And I didn't talk about the present presidential election that we had. I actually talked about the image of Hillary Clinton during when she was running against Obama. Not because I don't think that we also saw those things represented in this election, but in that one I actually heard people that were interviewed talk about how women were irrational and incapable of being president because they were unable to make those rational decisions. They would make emotional decisions. So I talked about it from that one because I actually heard those interviews. I know there were things that were also said during this time, okay, that unable to, no one actually came out that I know of and said because of her being a woman, she was too emotional and could not make the decisions that needed to be made. But the context that they placed her in. Some people have snapped out of it. We have the mere fact that I talk about these things, that I teach an honors colloquium, that I do presentations on this, that we teach sociology of gender roles, means that there are people out there talking about it. And one of the first things you do is you recognize when that happens. And then you hope, it's slow, you hope that slowly the change happens. And it would be so much easier if you could just point fingers at men, sorry guys, and say, this is your fault, you did this. But it's not just men. There are many, many, many women who also believe that to be true. So it's not only related to the gender of males, it's related to how we socialize both men and women into what they believe are the appropriate ways for men and women to behave. And it is changing, but it's been a really slow, slow path. And I think we went backwards this, personal opinion here, I think we went backwards this election. Yes.
Women are now allowed in the army and they're allowed to be leaders and have guns. So that, in my lifetime, that was an issue for a long time.
Oh, yes. Well, and didn't I hear that that the president has been talking about reinstating the draft, and that if the draft is reinstated, that it will not just be men who will be drafted, it will be women who will also be drafted. That's where my feminism has a little bit of trouble. I'm very happy not to have been drafted because I'm old enough that I don't think, could I have been drafted? When was the last draft? Early 70s. Yeah, I was 17, 18 in 73. So yeah, I could have been drafted. Yeah, Leslie?
Well, hi. First of all, I want to thank you so much, Laura, for this. This was absolutely brilliant. This was wonderful.
Okay.
What I wanted to ask, you said at the very beginning, you talked about the possibility for women's agency, and so I was wondering if the specter of madness that's used to contain women, or as a consequence for transcending gender boundaries, is there some opportunity for agency within madness too? Is that something you found with Vanessa, for example, or with any of these others, instead of just being the boogeyman that outlines boundaries of normal?
You get agency in, you don't get agency in Jane Eyre. You don't get agency in The Yellow Wallpaper. You don't get agency in Tennessee Williams' plays. The women are all acted upon. Any agency, any action that they try to take, any independence that they try to demonstrate is identified as being mad. You do see agency in Kill Bill. You do see agency in Penny Dreadful. And you think things in Penny Dreadful are going to be okay until Vanessa Ives identifies that in order to stop the big bad bogeyman devil, that she needs to die. So she allows Ethan Chandler, the werewolf, to kill her. So you're seeing agency, you're seeing her fight against it, you're seeing her work her way through it, making decisions, helping solve the problems that are there, but ultimately she needs to die in the end. In Kill Bill, it certainly is agency. She certainly does do away with her attackers. She does away with the people that she thinks has killed her child. So yeah, I think what I'm seeing in today's popular culture is a greater level of agency, and sometimes it's successful. Think about the Resident Evil movies, okay, which comes from the video game. Oh, I love those novels. The Girl with the Dragon Tattoo, very definitely identified by the Swedish, I don't know if it's Human Services, as being mad. She certainly takes agency there. So we're seeing some of it, but there's still a lot of it. You know, it's that crazy woman thing. And we just put up with her. So we are seeing some of it. Anything else?
When I was in Southeast Asia, I read a book on the psychoanalytical theory of mental illness. And, I mean, there was no other books to read, so I read it. But
A little bit of light reading.
even back then in the early 70s, they made excuses for the brilliance of the mad men. Tolstoy, Jack London did his best works. You're right. They excused the men's brilliance by their madness, and they don't really do that for women.
No, Virginia Woolf has to put stones in her pockets and walk into the pond. Yeah. Yeah.
Megyn Kelly, Trump saying about Megyn Kelly that she was getting a little worked up, and blood was coming out of her eyes, or who knows where.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah. That's that lunacy. That's related to menstruation in women, and I haven't done a study of this, but I know that Cheryl Anagnopoulos, one of our psychology professors, talks about this fake idea of PMS, that PMS does, it's a socially constructed kind of thing that happens, that there are physical There are physical kinds of responses to menstruation that we could call PMS, but this emotionality that supposedly exists does not really. Because, for example, women in Japan don't suffer from PMS. Women from Japan don't suffer from hot flashes either. I had them. How come I have them? It's socially constructed. Okay, socially constructed. We define things in a particular way, and then we say that they're real. Another, and you looked at psychoanalytical theory, Thomas Szasz, S-Z-A-S-Z, says that there is no such thing really as schizophrenia. That schizophrenia, schizophrenics are people that we find uncomfortable to be around. And therefore we define them in a particular way. We define them as crazy, and therefore they are seen as crazy. And we medically treat them. We give them drugs to deal with it. Now, I haven't come to terms with that quite yet. I find that one's kind of difficult for me to come to terms with. I've known people with schizophrenia, and I've known how the delusions, the hallucinations that they suffer are terrifying for them. But it does make one think. There are different cultures, less sophisticated technological cultures, where people who have what we would identify as schizophrenia, that there is space provided for them within their culture. They're kept safe. They're given the opportunity to participate in their culture in a way that is respectful and is seen as real work. And they're included. They're not excluded. We exclude people who have schizophrenia and other kinds of mental illness. People are still today afraid to let others know that they suffer from depression because of the stigmatization of it. So yeah.
How about
transgendered people were at one time seen as mad. That's an area that you need to talk about, or that Will. Is Will still here? He was here. I don't study transgender. I know that in different cultures, transgendered individuals were seen not as detrimental, not as harmful, but were seen as individuals who had keener insight, the Berdache, in different cultures. In Western European culture, we're so binary focused. We're so, this is one sex, this is the other sex, and anybody who does anything differently have got to be mentally ill. And we should somehow medically treat them, or psychologically treat them, psychiatrically treat them, and bring them back to this binary world. And I know that other cultures don't do that. Again, they find a place where being transgendered might be different from how most people are, but is an acceptable alternative. So I think in that sense, transgender does fit into that. Boy, we've gone from Jane Eyre to transgender. This is a huge, huge topic area. Yes?
Thank you again for the wonderful lecture. So when it comes to pop culture, bringing it back to there, how do we change it? How do we fix it? Like, how do we go from having to worry if a woman is considered too outgoing, where people are going to think that she's insane, and then to held back against society when we don't even have to think about that with male characters? They have an excuse for everything, you know, for lack of a better phrase. How do we fix that? How do we fix that in culture?
Boy, that's a huge question. That's a really huge question. The simple answer is that we need to socialize people differently. So the answer is simple. The doing of that is huge, really huge. And think about how far we've come and how far we have yet to go from, say, Victorian neurasthenic rest cures. Okay, we've come a long way from that. changes have been huge. Just as you mentioned, things when you were younger were very different from how they are today in the freedom that women are allowed and how women are defined. But there's a lot left to do. It's in how we raise kids. It's in how we represent people in popular culture. You can't stop people from representing them that way, though. We live in a free society where we are able to represent people as we choose. I suppose we could vote with our dollars by not playing the video games that represent things that way, by not going to the movies, by choosing not to buy the books. We can do it that way. But this is not something that's going to happen overnight. It's slow. It's really slow. So I don't have an answer for that. If you have children, raise them differently. And that is one of the ways. We raise our children differently. I wish I had an answer. I'm sorry. That's a tough one. What? But it's not an immediately hopeful answer. It's a slow answer. Anybody else? Yes. Oh, I never wait. I'm sorry.
I just, my time in Southeast Asia allowed me to see how they deal with this. Mm-hmm. And they're, like you said, they give space. They have functionality in their groups for the katoi is the word for that in Thailand. And they're accepted and functionable.
Are you talking about transgender people?
Yes, yes. Mm-hmm. Amazing. You mentioned space. They really do give them space over there, and we don't. I agree.
We never have.
Right.
And now we're beginning to give space. And individuals who are transgendered are demanding space. So yeah. And that is another thing. People can demand. It's legal to demand. We can go out, I suppose, and we can march. Protest, like the Women's March.
Join feminist organizations.
Mm-hmm. Yep. There's one here in town, from what I understand. I believe that organization is called NOW.
Yeah, the National Organization for Women has a branch here.
And we can teach people that being feminists isn't about hating men. Being a feminist and identifying these things that exist is about being people, about looking at equality for people in general, and that the face of feminism is not necessarily a woman's face. The face of feminism is also a male face. It always has been, yeah. It's been misidentified, and the term feminist has gotten a really bad rap. Really bad one over the past 30 years. Yep. Mm-hmm. Exactly. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I talk to the young women in my classes, like your age, and you use that word feminist, and are you a feminist? Well, of course not. Okay, I like men, and that's kind of like apples and oranges. Being a feminist is about equality of experience, equality of opportunity, etc. So you teach people that, and you talk about that. Yeah.
I heard a study was done, I think in England, and they would ask people if they were feminist.
Or if you believed in equality for women. If they asked if they were a feminist, almost everybody said that they weren't. And if they asked about equality, almost everybody said that they were for equality.
Yeah.
So it seems like the word in of itself has changed meaning, which is interesting.
Yeah, it's feminazi. There's been a lot of people who have seen that as a negative word. Yeah, that's okay. Bye-bye. Anybody else? Sure.
over the last, I don't know, 30 years that you were talking about with feminists, that somebody has successfully brought that madness to femininity, or the feminist name. And people kind of think of feminists as mad in what you've talked about tonight. And I don't know how that happened. I lived through all that. But I remember in the beginning they were kind of heroes. And then they kind of got this madness. So what are your thoughts on that?
Well, there are different kinds of feminism. Boy, that's hard. Yeah.
Well, a part of that problem comes from the news media and our social media, because they only show the most extreme of anyone. So you get the worst out of everything comes to the forefront. It's not the best, it's the worst that shows on the media. So.
And radical feminism had some really very non-mainstream ideas. And those were the ones, to use what you were talking about, that are often highlighted because it makes a good story. And that became the image of what a feminist was, rather than the individuals who were looking for equal opportunities in employment, equal opportunities in pay, to be able to have equal opportunities in education. And we see a situation now where some of those fights have been fought and have been very successful. So young women, for example, if you ask them whether or not they should have the same educational opportunities, and you ask young men about young women, and they all say, yeah, of course they should. Should people who do the same job, should they be paid the same? Well, sure, of course they should. That's sort of moved its way into the norm. That's what we see as the norm. People should have those opportunities. So they don't see that as part of feminism anymore, because that is just the way things are in our present day. They don't see, they perceive feminism to be women who are not feminine. They perceive feminism as to be individuals who are not heterosexual. And they don't like those things. So that term feminist has come to mean something different than it did before, even though a lot of what feminists fought for have become part of what we actually have as our rights and our opportunities in this culture. So it's the word that people find problematic. It's not the values behind the word that they do. And feminists haven't been able to do that kind of reclaiming of the term yet, where Black Americans have reclaimed the N-word, and gay Americans have reclaimed queer. But feminists have not been able to reclaim feminism. That's still considered to be a pejorative term by a lot of young people. So we don't talk about that so much. You know, we talk about the issues in classrooms. And then I do what you were talking about, which is, and then I point out to them that all of these things that you say, well, those are feminist ideas. So guess what? You are a feminist. But that's sort of what happened after, you know, women who burned their bras were seen as crazy. Not very many women burn their bras, by the way. Anything else? No. No, they don't burn well. No. That was a publicity stunt for the mass media. The big thing with the fire going and the bras going into it. They just didn't buy them, didn't wear them. Yeah. Anything else?
It's horrible to say, but most people that lived under a rock, Gloria Steinem is the only name I can jump out at you that I consider a feminist.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
Good or bad, that's the name that pops out for me.
Well, and maybe that's okay. Maybe that's okay, because does that mean that that feminism just sort of entered the mainstream? You know, and I think in a lot of cases it did. Thank you. Well, thank you. I really appreciate that you came. It's been an interesting conversation. Have a nice evening.